Special Collections team here at NUS Libraries, and welcome to the NUS Libraries Biodiversity Seminar Series. So we are very pleased that you guys could join us for this fascinating talk titled Coral Reefs, Communities, and Conservation, the Wallace Line and Beyond. And just a little PSA, today's session will be recorded and will be made online afterwards. So before we start the talk, we would like to do a little publicity and to introduce some of the biodiversity collections in our library. So, firstly, we have our Biodiversity Library of Southeast Asia, or BELSI for short. So BELSI is our online open access online archives. It's part of our digital gem. So our BELSI collection holds digitized copies of key biodiversity resources specific to Singapore, many of which date back to the colonial period. And if you're interested, you can feel free to scan this QR code if you want. If you're interested, then sometimes people scan it. Okay. And next, we also have the zoological records on the Web of Science. So it's one of the key databases that NUS Libraries subscribes to. So, and as a staff or student, you have full institutional access. So again, if you're interested, you may scan the QR code, or after the session, you can approach me and we can show you the QR code again. And then we have the, if you want to access to any of these databases, you can log into, go to our library main web portal and click on databases under the NUS Search Plus search bar. And then we have the Biodiversity Heritage Library. So this is an open source website. You don't need to log into your NUS account, or anyone, members of the public can access free of charge. Of course, we have the NUS Libraries blog, which is our blog. So these consist of blog articles written by our very own librarians, and they feature some of our very own special collections and also the stories behind these collections. So each blog article features different books on different topics, some related to our biodiversity collections, as you see here, on civets, wildcats, leopardcats, you name it. So. And also, finally, if at the end of this session, if you're really interested, to your right, we have a collection of books from our physical books from our collection, some of which are from our rare books collection. So if you're interested, you can feel free to explore and browse through those books. So if any of those interest you. So I think that's, and also, there will be a reading list that will be posted shortly after the event on our NUS Libraries blogs. So don't worry, everything will be on the blog. So, okay, so now let's start the lecture or this event proper. Let me just introduce our speaker for today. So our speaker is Dr. Gretchen Christina Kaufman, who is a senior lecturer in the geography department here at NUS. So she is a conservation biogeographer and a restoration ecologist. She earned her PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles in environmental science in 2007. Her research focuses on coral reef restoration, coastal biodiversity, and the use of geospatial technologies such as drones, satellite imaging, and 3D mapping to evaluate ecosystem recovery at meaningful ecological and community scales. Her NUS Roots to Reef 360 project is an award-winning immersive virtual field trip that enables students to better understand tropical biodiversity and conservation challenges. So today she'll be sharing some of her recent experiences focused on the Coral Triangle, where she collaborates closely with local communities, NGOs, and educators to develop participatory approaches to restoration and conservation education. So it is my absolute pleasure to invite Dr. Gretchen to share her thoughts on this interesting topic. So, Dr. Kaufman, please.
Yeah, Shaman. So much. Hey, great to see everyone here today. Thanks for taking some time out of your valuable time out of your afternoon today. My students would be here, but they're all in classes. They're very excited to hear a little bit more about conservation biogeography, and in particular, the work I do around restoration of coral reefs, seagrass, and mangroves. So that's what I'm going to talk to you guys today about. So I love this name, right? I'm going to talk about coral reefs, but I'm also going to talk about mangroves, focusing on community-based restoration of those two ecosystems and conservation in terms of marine protection, okay? And I want to start on the Wallace Line, and as a conservation biogeographer, we talk so much about Charles Darwin, but I wanted to introduce you to another famous biogeographer in history. But first, I want to talk about where we are. So my question to you guys to get started is, where are we in the world? Where are we? You're laughing. Okay, but where are we here? We're at NUS, right? Southeast Asia, obviously, right? Okay, where else? Singapore, the little red dot, right? So I'm going to take you on a journey from the little red dot of Singapore. Oh yeah, there's another point here. The little red dot of Singapore, which we hope is going to become a little green dot soon in our city and nature, which I teach my students about, this vision in the UN decade. And then I'm going to take you to the first place where I started conducting coral reef restoration, and I still work on restoration of all tropical ecosystems there. And my Roots to Reefs film that you just heard about was filmed there because I couldn't take my students during the pandemic when I moved here to wild Borneo and wild Indonesia, and so I wanted to bring the wilderness here to NUS students. You can still see that right down around the corner in the 360 IMAX theater, a little promo for Tech Central here on the 4th floor. Let me know afterwards if you want to see it in a VR headset. I have that as well. All right, so we're going to start at Sabah, Malaysia, Borneo. Then I'm going to take you to the Wallace Line, where it all started. Bali, Lombok, and even a little bit about Komodo and where I just got back from, West Papua and Raja Ampat. So from the east to the west, from the west to the east rather. All right, so what does this all look like? Well, to me, as a geographer and a biogeographer, it looks like this. Beautiful from the sky, right? We're all about place, space, scale, and environment. And my environment is diving. I've been wetter than I've been dry in the last 3 weeks. I started at a conference. We were there in Manokwari with the Center for Nature-Based Climate Solutions at NUS, presenting a little bit of this research, and then going to Raja Ampat, the Fayam Islands, and geosites like this beautiful beach here with the coral reefs. So it all looks so pristine when we see it from the air. These are all my drone imageries, by the way. I'm a drone pilot as well. Okay, and these in particular on the bottom were 360 snapshots or screenshots from my new films, short films that I'm going to show on Raja Ampat and Bali pretty darn soon in my research. All right, so this is what it looks like though underwater. Most people don't get to appreciate the beauty of this, except for maybe in 2D film. Okay, so I'm now showing this not only over here in the theater, but in VR headsets, so you can look up, down, all around in 360 and really feel like you're diving and in this coral reef right here without getting salty and wet. It's pretty amazing. I'm showing it to the communities as I travel. I just got back really late Sunday night from these 3 weeks of traveling through all those coral reefs and mangroves. All right, so here's our cute little sea turtle, hawksbill turtle in a beautiful protected area by Sabah Marine Parks in Sipadan Island, Sabah, Malaysia, Borneo. where I started diving, my very first dive in Borneo in Southeast Asia. So I love to show this picture a friend of mine took. I took this one filming nearby in a seagrass bed, but next to a community of conservation divers. Okay, and even if we're focused on coral reef restoration and community, there's still impacts that come along with us being there. And so one of the reasons there's such healthy seagrass and our beautiful sea turtles is because there is excess nutrients from the development. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the impacts, but really focus on the hope that I have for Southeast Asia, Singapore, and really focusing in on the coral triangle next to Singapore. All right. So not only do we have the highest biodiversity of coral, but also seagrass and mangroves. So we have something like 500 species of coral, but probably 1,000. We haven't identified half of them because the area is so vast in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the region. Okay, but we have 48 species in Indonesia alone of mangrove species, true mangroves, and total there's somewhere between 70 and 80. All the scientists argue over what's a true mangrove, but more than half, 2/3, are found in Indonesia. And that's what brought me to Singapore and beyond. Does anyone know how many mangrove species are in Singapore? I like to relate it back. Anyone? Renee? No? You don't? I wish. Why would you think Singapore would have 100 and all of Indonesia would have 35? Okay, that's wishful thinking. I wish. Okay, maybe we're importing some. But they're only 70 to 80 worldwide. So Singapore is really lucky. We still, even though we're an urban center, have 35. Okay, and we're trying to reintroduce some that used to be here. So we're increasing all the time. All right, but there's also the wildlife on land, from mangroves all the way up the catchment to rainforest. And this is what I'm taking my students in a course called Resilience and Restoration this May to Sabah, Malaysia, Borneo to see these incredible charismatic wildlife. I care about it all. This is what brought me to Borneo in the first place with my University of San Francisco class, conservation class. Okay, so we still go to see this one. And so that's the beauty of the biodiversity of Southeast Asia, right here next to Singapore in the Coral Triangle. Well, most of you came to hear about Wallace, so I'm going to talk about Wallace for the next few minutes. And here's what he looked like, and I have a fun, quick story. I was with my collaborators about a month ago in Lombok, Indonesia. I'm getting a research grant to do the work I'm talking about in this talk, okay, to map everything around the Wallace Line, because we need to know what we have so we can protect it. We need to know what was destroyed or impacted so we can fix it. And people that live around this region need to know what is there. And when I show these films to the communities, they're like, oh my God, there's a shark. There's 10 sharks. There's a huge manta 10 times the size of me. Look, Mom, I can swim. They're so animated compared to our Singapore students. I see a few in the audience. They're excited, but not like that. Because these communities see what they have right next to them. And they can't swim or dive, and most of us can't. Okay? So right here on the Wallace Line, here's Southeast Asia, map of Southeast Asia. Okay? This line right here, this red line right here, going from between Bali and Lombok through the Lombok Strait, and through the deep strait here between Borneo and Sulawesi, and past the Philippines, is called the Wallace Line because Alfred Wallace, Russell Wallace, spent a lot of time there. But when I went into my collaborator's office, trying to get the research permit, I immediately looked at him, and the first thing that came to mind was John Muir, because I'm from California. They look similar, but Wallace has glasses, and 10 seconds later I said, that's Wallace, because yeah, my hero. And I said, mine too, because he studies whale sharks. He's a marine scientist. Like, like me, and he loves the grandfather or father of biogeography. All right, so how many of you have actually heard about Wallace before you came today? And no one online could probably say that. Maybe thumbs up. Okay, 2/3 of you, maybe half to 2/3, right? Well, my students usually have not when they come into my classroom. So that's a fun story to tell about the difference between who everyone knows, Charles Darwin, who got all the credit for describing evolution through natural selection. But actually, at the very same time he was writing about that, our friend over here, who's a bit younger, Alfred Russel Wallace, was on an expedition, an 8-year-long expedition through Southeast Asia, through the Malaya archipelago. But even before that, through the Amazon. He was a field biologist, ecologist like me, but had no training and no money. So what did he do to raise funds? He collected. He was an avid collector. On his travels, he collected something like 125,000 species of insects, birds, mammals, and all sorts of other biological specimens. And he then went back and sold them to Great Britain, to the UK, and private collections. Okay. All right, so let's go backwards. I forgot one point here, is that when he was traveling for these 8 years, starting in Singapore, he realized that this was a deep channel, a couple of deep straits, and that the wildlife on either side and the plants on either side on land were significantly different, especially dramatically different along this line. And that's why today we've named it the Wallace Line. Okay. So even though Darwin developed this idea through the years and corresponded with his scientifically trained friends, Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker, the 4 of them, you can see old photographs of them working together. It was all about dialogue, scientific dialogue with these naturalists, and talking as a team about what was happening and what they were seeing on these expeditions. And remember, they didn't have cell phones. They couldn't just call each other up and tell each other what they were finding. They had really, really, really slow snail mail. Sometimes the letters would take 6 months to a year. So when they finally all got together and talked about it, they developed evolution together. Okay? But Wallace here is my hero because he's a true field ecologist, biologist, biogeographer at heart. And that's what I do. I feel better being on, in, or under the water, or walking through muddy mangroves than in a lecture theater. Okay? So really love this guy. And what I tell my students is that it's not about data collection back then. It was about making observations about natural and physical phenomena. So all of our modern sciences today, not just evolution and conservation biogeography and science, as well as geology, tectonic movements, everything came from these guys a couple hundred years ago. Okay, but their collaboration reminds me that science advances not just through discovery, but through this dialogue and teamwork. All right, so where did Wallace go? He started in Singapore. Where's Singapore? Right here in the little red dot that's going to become green. And he went all over all these black lines. And here's the Wallace Line right here. For 8 years, living with the locals. His main collector, Ali, was really, really important. And when you read, I'm right now reading in the middle of one of these big books over here, the Malay archipelago that he wrote, about his field notebook, the field notebooks that he wrote, which were really, really detailed. He talked about how the locals helped him and shot animals. And it breaks my heart because I love all the animals. But this is how they collected described, documented, and how science knows most of the organisms around this area. He traveled 22,000 kilometers rather, by boat. We're in Singapore, not the US, sorry. 22,000 kilometers, which sounds better too, it's a larger number, by boat with very little fruits, vegetables like we know today, mostly surviving on dried meat and liquids. All right. So here is the Wallace Line, which we draw right through here. And what did he discover? Well, he discovered that animals on this side of the Wallace Line were more like Asia, more like Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indochina than they were like the wildlife on the other side that were more like Australia, kangaroos, marsupials, cockatoos. We had invasive cockatoos here from Australia. They're not from Singapore, okay? And then the only primate that really got across, because right here, that got across were macaques. And I see macaques swimming all the time in South Malaysian Borneo. So if you couldn't swim and you couldn't fly long distances, you were stuck on one side or other of this really deep strait right here. For all the last ice ages, it never got deeper than about 160 meters. And these deep channels are much, much deeper, and the currents are much, much stronger. Okay, so this Wallace Line is really, really important to conservation biogeography. From 18,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago, we had what's called, you guys probably heard of it if you lived and grew up in Singapore, but the Sunda Shelf, or Sunda Land right here. Okay, so all of this was connected. Most of the orange or the tan, though, were streams, rivers, wetlands, like I studied. So we could walk from Singapore to Borneo or Sumatra very easily. Or if we had a boat at least, okay? A small boat going up those rivers. So all of this was connected. But where it stopped was right here where I work, between Bali and Lombok, Indonesia. Here's Lombok. And that Lombok Strait, which I cross every time I go on a ferry to do my research over in Lombok or over in Bali, reminds me of how hectic it would be for an animal or plant to get between those two locations. Okay. Elephants do swim. I've seen them swim many times in Borneo, but not that good. Okay. So here we go. Here's the opposite side of the Sunda Shelf, which tends to be drier and is more like Australia. All right, then getting on to the topic of today's lecture is under the sea. Okay, what do we know under the sea? Is there a Wallace Line here? And the answer is yes, but there's more of a gradient. It's not as distinct. Okay, on land, the Wallace Line is a sharp boundary. These deep water trenches and straits prevented mammals from crossing, creating a dramatic split between this Asian and Australasian fauna. But underwater, the story is very different. Okay, because marine species have planktonic stages where they float. When the coral spawns, they're like plankton. They float around the sea, and they can travel long distances. Okay, and they can really, in these ocean currents and across these straits, can travel pretty quickly. So the boundary becomes more permeable, more dynamic. Instead of this hard Wallace Line, this is the exciting part that I want to talk to you guys today about, is this region becomes a mixing zone. Something like a biodiversity engine, where the Indo-Pacific lineage overlaps, diversifying and evolving. Okay, this is the hotspot of the hotspot of biodiversity. And it is within this extraordinary complex seascape that today's coral reefs and mangrove ecosystems exist, including on the edge here in Singapore. So the question no longer is just where does this boundary lie, because it's porous and it's more like an ecotone underwater. But how can we conserve, protect, restore the living organisms in this engine of biodiversity? Okay, so that's what I want to focus on today. And I call this my roots to reefs connection. And I named this, I think I even copyrighted it back in the US when I came up with this idea. A partner of mine studied sharks and I studied mangroves, and we wanted to come meet in the middle. And so we came up with this roots to reefs because the sharks are born in the mangroves, in the roots. And I went diving in the roots of the mangroves in Raja Ampat just a week ago. All right, so this is what it looks like when you dive in the mangroves in Raja Ampat. In many places, we call these the blue mangrove, blue water mangroves, sorry. The blue water, you can kind of see the blue water up top here, but from above, if I were to take a drone shot from above, it all looks blue, super blue. We have a lot of sand that makes it blue, but also these beautiful corals underneath. And somewhere in between, you have seagrass as well. So you have all three ecosystems coinciding. And so it was my dream to go around to Unbound. I'm so excited to be with you today because I saw it for myself. I didn't just read about it. I made observations, I filmed it, and I'm going to start thinking about it very, very deeply. Forgot to mention, I've never given this presentation before, so this is hot off the press. Okay, very exciting stuff. So the question is, what is the importance of this connection? There's so many different levels of the importance of this connection between mangroves, coral reefs, and seagrass in between. And students in our geography department, PhD students and master students, are currently studying this. I want to go through some of these research projects, but there are many more. All right, so if this, I'm going to show. This is from my Tree Lab website. This is a 360 film I took. You're only seeing it 2D because we don't have a 360 theater, but that is from our mangrove restoration project to the beach seagrass in coral reefs in Lombok, Indonesia that we filmed. This is a 98-meter Tawau Falls. This is a huge waterfall in the heart of Borneo, reminding us that the water comes from the top of the highest mountains and rainfall and fog and waterfalls like that. And everything that happens upstream affects what is downstream. So when we dive or snorkel or swim in these coral reefs, we can't forget that what we do, like palm oil plantations, communities, development, all of these human impacts are going to affect what's downstream. But the good news is mangroves help. They're like the kidneys of ecosystems in the catchment. They're really great at so many ecosystem services, including nutrient pollution, filtration. All right, so here's the catchment in our 360 film, Roots to Reefs, where we explore connections between aquatic ecosystems from the tiny headwater streams near that waterfall, that huge waterfall here, the tiny streams, and all the rainfall in the heart of Malaysia, Borneo, the heart of Borneo, going down all these tiny streams that converge to form larger rivers, in this case, the large Tongan River, one of the largest catchments, as well as longest rivers in all of Borneo and all of Southeast Asia. Right? And then they end up down here in mangroves the size of Singapore, literally the size of Singapore. And there's something like 40 to 50 meters tall. That's taller than any mangrove I've ever seen in Singapore, Lombok, any of these other places. It's incredible. Then where do they go? Well, after the water goes through this filtration system, they go out through the estuary into the coral reefs. So I teach my students about how all of these aquatic ecosystems are connected. Okay. And I'm sorry I'm not presenting over here because my students always tell me stay to one screen. So I hope everyone over there can see what I'm pointing at over here. All right. So why should you care? I have a couple of reasons why the average person should care. And you guys are probably not the average people, but why do I care? Number one, because the wildlife that cannot help themselves use mangrove ecosystems a lot. So dugongs and manatees, I grew up swimming with manatees. It's one on my bucket list to swim with a dugong, but they're much more elusive, much more effective. Okay, alligators back home, but crocodiles here in Singapore that I went snorkeling and scuba diving with potentially. The sharks and rays that I love so much, all of these spend a portion of their life or a significant portion of their life in the mangrove ecosystem. So it was really exciting to see so many sharks, rays, little fish, thankfully no crocodiles in the mangroves. All right, so we see every couple of years we get an article that shows sharks and the importance of mangroves as a nursery to sharks, but also to all sorts of other organisms that this infographic shows, sharks, barracuda, small reef fish, our little mud skipper here. But all sorts of other mangrove ecosystem services are provided to us through these mangrove ecosystems. Okay, blue carbon I'm going to highlight. Has anyone heard of that term, blue carbon or blue carbon ecosystems? Maybe a couple of you guys that were in my class, professors. Okay, so what else? Oxygen, that's a no-brainer, okay? Plants produce, these trees like this produce 50% of the oxygen that we breathe. And all those locals that live along and around the mangroves, if they don't cut them down, they can use them little by little as sustainable resources. But over the years, as population has increased, they cut them down more and more so around their communities in Indonesia where I work, for building materials, boats, charcoal. They're all so important because they live in water half of their lives. They're really adapted to wet conditions. Okay, so they have these characteristics and trade-offs to being really good for boat building or for ceilings and building material for houses for the local. But it's all about education because they can use other materials. But if they cut down all of the mangroves, they're not going to provide all these other ecosystem services that they need for things like coastal protection from large storms. Okay, what about biodiversity and habitat we talked about, as well as ecotourism that they can make money off of. They can be eco tour guides. It actually makes this more sustainable livelihoods. Okay, and finally, water quality that I talked about briefly. Okay, and they are a nursery for the coral reef. So there's that connection between corals, seagrass, and mangroves. All right, so for those of you that have not heard of economic value of blue carbon or blue carbon ecosystems, here's just a quick graph to show that mangroves, and this is cut off on our slide here, but it's about 91,000 US dollars, which is something like 120,000 Singapore dollars per hectare. That mangrove ecosystems are worth if they're healthy, compared to this tiny little sliver that I did my master's research on in San Francisco, California. Or to seagrass, which is only like 12,000 per hectare. Or the deep sea, and you don't even see coral reefs on there yet. Okay, the jury is still out as to if they're a net sink or source. So this is just showing all the different ecosystems here, and mangroves have the highest value economically. Right, but they're threatened. Yes.
May I ask a question
Sure,
here? So
absolutely.
I'm wondering what does it even mean to be of economic value? Is this like the amount, judging by the name, is this about the amount of carbon they can store and like how much it would cost to store the same amount of carbon artificially? Or
That's an excellent question. So I kind of briefed over this because I have a feeling everyone had heard this term before. But this is a comparison of, and there are different estimates from different studies, of course, but this is just the simplest one to show you. But the estimate of how much that is worth if we protect it or restore it, that ecosystem. So it just describes that mangroves have the highest capacity for storing carbon. So if we cut it down and burn it, where does the carbon go to? The atmosphere, right? So one of the organizations I visited and been to mangroves is actually figuring out, I don't think anyone else has quite done this like they have, figuring out instead of cutting down their mangroves to make, they're making press board with it, I think, or wood chips for press board. Instead of doing that, right? Yeah, wood chips, but I'm not sure what to use the wood chips for. But they're making wood chips, but we also cut it down for other reasons, mostly charcoal. But they're figuring out ways to store that. So to cut down some of the trees that they have planted or came back naturally and cutting them down to thin them when they're too thick and putting them back into the soil to store the carbon. Okay, but the highest value goes to the most historic natural mangrove ecosystems. And that's what this 91,000 shows, the highest potential for storage of carbon. And I'm probably not explaining it as well as you because it's not my area of expertise, but just a book really studies. So, but great question. So it's just a relative comparison showing how important these ecosystems are, and that coral reefs aren't even on here. Okay, so I think that's an important point right here, and that is a little bit too much to get into for this conversation. But we are working on with our collaborators on estimating the dynamics and storage capacity for coral reefs as well. All right, but the point here is that we want to protect these ecosystems. And one of the mechanisms that I'll talk about in a bit is protecting them through the carbon market or carbon credits. Again, this is not my expertise, it's just part of my story, but great question. Okay, these mangroves, like I said, are threatened by, this is historically, for centuries, by the local communities cutting, especially rhizophora species, red mangrove species, their branches down to make charcoal in kilns. And that's throughout the region and throughout the world. And still you can buy charcoal that was made from mangroves to this day, right? But the idea is to not cut it all down so it serves for all those other ecosystem services. What we're seeing a lot of in the last 30 years is, especially if you fly in and out of Bangkok, has anyone seen the what look like fish ponds? A lot of those are aquaculture fish ponds, but shrimp ponds. So I gave up eating shrimp 20 years ago because I found out that's where most of my shrimp comes from. Something like 90 to 95% in the US comes from places like Bangkok. And I don't want to cut down mangroves just to have shrimp. I can get my protein else other ways. Right. Also, what we are stable here from rice and the less brackish but more freshwater mangrove ecosystems. And then this picture just shows what happens when we develop areas that used to be mangroves into tourism and resorts. They are now no longer buffers for large storms. And this is a picture taken after 2005, about 20 years ago, after the big tsunami. So that was Thailand 18. So areas where they had mangroves, I went right after there to help on a project in Thailand. Areas right after the tsunami were protected if they still had mangrove ecosystems. A lot of those areas that were overbuilt had a lot of destruction. So here's just a graphic to show what I'm talking about. Imagine a future without healthy mangroves here. And we're on a trajectory toward a future without as much as we used to have and not enough to filter all the urban and rural pollution that comes off the landscapes. It's connected to these healthy seabeds, and then that forms healthy reefs with higher biodiversity of fish, larger fish, and more abundant fish. And if those areas are protected and marine protected areas, the spillover can be very, very important for the fishing outside the marine protected areas. So we don't have marine protected areas that protect mangroves as well, which is in Indonesia the case. The mangroves are not protected through those marine protected areas, but in other parts of the world they are. Okay? We get something like this, where we have less and less reef fish, smaller and smaller and fewer species. Okay. All right, so my solution, the rest of my talk is on solutions. Feel free to ask questions. This is the part that is about my research and I want to talk about today. A lot of it is hot off the press because I've been thinking about it as I travel around Indonesia in the last 3 weeks and over the last 6 years since I've been to Singapore. It's really community-based or community-led ecosystem restoration, from roots to reefs, from mangroves to seagrass, all the way to the coral reefs. And the hardest is the coral reefs. That's why I'm starting to focus, and my students are really getting engaged in the coral reef restoration. But I started in the mangroves in the UN decade. I moved here in 2020 to work at NUS in the geography department and as an associate director of the environmental studies program to teach our students about restoration. Because I've been a restoration ecologist since I was their age, and I haven't seen a huge change. Everything has been so small scale and private company and government driven. And I'm talking from most of my experience in the US. Okay, but I worked in Europe, Africa, and now Asia. We've spent something like $2 trillion annually. This is at the beginning of the UN decade. So we're still waiting for the next number to come out, but trillions of dollars every year in restoration, and we're not scaling it up and getting it right. I've seen so many failures in my lifetime throughout the world. So that's why I'm here, because we are here in the hotspot of biodiversity. Right? Like I explained before, why does that matter? I'm going to explain that in the next few slides. Okay, in the UN decade, what are we doing globally? Okay? Well, we're as scientists, I think, studying the state of our altered systems. It's time to take action. And that's what restoration ecologists are trying to do globally. Okay? We know a lot about climate variability, but it's going faster than we ever predicted. And there's so much emphasis in the IPCC about this globally. We have not, as a restoration ecologist, done well at evaluating past restoration. I'm a big critic of evaluation. So my research focuses on evaluation of restoration projects. What do we fund in restoration typically? Planting with locals, getting that photo op with the community, right? We can plant trees online on apps now, right? It's awesome. But all these big foundations, grants, governments, private corporations, they're paying mostly for implementation. But we need to understand past restoration successes as much as the failures so we can inform restoration action and get on a better trajectory toward the rainbow here in this city and nature and our vision here in Singapore and around the world. All right, so this is a picture of the kids where I was flying my new anti-gravity 360 drone, which just came out in December. It was really exciting, but I actually was more interested in playing with the kids and talking about Hasa to them and waving to them, because this is the future of Southeast Asia. I want to educate the youth of Southeast Asia to care more about this incredible biodiversity. So during the pandemic and during my stay in Singapore, I thought about very deeply, how can we support more resilient ecosystems and coastal communities in this UN decade? Okay, because this is where I live and I care about. So this is in Raja Ampat at one of our dive sites. Little kids fishing. These are some guys at work that we know from working with us. From that very first slide I showed you at Sabah, Malaysia, Borneo, on the island next to Pom Pom Island that we're working on restoration. They just got a grant from Pordap to build coral reefs. They actually have a little factory on their tiny little island of 100 people. Because track, the organization I started working with, and my PhD student, who's the director, Hazel Oakley, wrote that grant and begged funding to support the local communities. If we don't support them, figure out sustainable ways of supporting them, they're going to keep extracting. And so this is a really great opportunity for them to get involved in restoration, make money, become divers, help to put those coral reefs, those artificial reefs down below. And then by doing so, learn a lot about how to not destroy the reefs by fish bombing and other extractive uses. Okay, so I thought about this. This is where they live, not quite like how we live here in Singapore. So they can't just go down and get a job at the bank or at the McDonald's or at the university like we're lucky to have. Okay, they have to live off the land mostly. So since about 15 years ago, when I started teaching at University of San Francisco 16 years ago, I've been working with local communities in southern Malaysia, Borneo, along rivers and mangroves. And actually, my mother taught me from a young age to work as a volunteer cleaning up rivers since, 40 years ago. And this is how I got inspired to work with communities and care about the people that live around areas like Southeast Asia, and this one in particular. Here's one of my students that speaks fluent Bahasa. She lived there for 2 years and is working with the nursery manager planting a tree. Yes, that is a photo moment, but she actually lived and worked there. And if the grant didn't end, she would still be there today. She cared that much about the orangutan that she was working with and the local communities. Okay, so ecotourism and voluntourism was a big part of what we thought was the silver bullet for conservation of mangroves and coral reefs. This is from Lombok, Indonesia, where tourists came back right after the pandemic and started planting mangroves again. I started this project with Source, a local NGO, Yayasan, in 2019 because they really had a focus on coral reef restoration. And I said, it's really hard for locals to get involved in diving. So let's start on land and restore mangroves first. The only reason they were successful and survived the pandemic was because of the mangrove project that you see today. If it was based on ecotourism coming, students and the youth coming to spend money and dive and help with that restoration, they would have folded like a lot of other organizations did during the pandemic. So that mangrove project, funded by the Tree app, based in the UK, needed this restoration. So that leads me to resilience and restoration, the name of my course, my field course in Sabah. This resilience is incredibly important, and most of the time we think of resilience in terms of climate resilience and human communities, right? That's what I heard. But then my PhD student, Jonathan Wren, came to me during the pandemic. He said, I really want to work on an ISM with you, and I want to do independent research with you, and I want to work on resilience and restoration. I said, I hate that word. It's too big. It means so many things. And so we did a bunch of research on the definition of resilience. And it actually developed in the ecological literature, okay? So that was really cool. I was excited then. I got more excited about this word resilience. So to bend or break, like a little seedling or sapling or tree, a mangrove, for instance, okay? To bend but not break, to be resilient, even when there are big storm events, right? Right, so this resilience and restoration we wrote about, integrating this resilience concept into ecosystem restoration in light of impacts based on climate changes, right? And so we thought deeply about resistance, recovery, reorganization in this study. But just to simplify for today's lecture, I want to show you 4 main takeaways that drove this research that I suggested to Jonathan through what I was working on, my passion projects during the pandemic. And from my experience, my 35 years of experience. So what do we not do well? I started up with what are the 4 or the main challenges that we have in restoration. And the first, as I've mentioned, is that really, it's mostly top down. And believe me, I'm working with NParks. It's really, really important that we work with NParks and companies to get projects funded from the top down. But it's not only going to work if it's only top down. We need to engage the communities, the local people that can protect, help restore, and scale up restoration in Southeast Asia and around the world. And so I suggested these four primary novel restoration approaches to engage the community, not just in photo ops and planting, but in meaningful planning and getting permission from the village chief, the village head, the headman. And then the headman then goes to the next headman and the next village if it's successful and gets them excited. And it goes on and on throughout each island in Indonesia, is what we're seeing. Planting, monitoring, everything, okay? All the different steps they need to be involved in. And to develop here, this is my research, what my research is based on, developing simple, implementable monitoring plans that communities can carry out. And we are doing that throughout Borneo and Indonesia at selected community NGOs. Then scaling up to the larger landscape approach is really important as well. We've seen most in my career, I've seen mostly smallish, hectare to 10 hectare projects, right? The really big ones are rare and really expensive. So how are we gonna scale up a landscape approach like a geographer would think about? Well, it takes funding. So we have to think about ways of finding and seeking unique, diversified, novel, and sustainable funding. Hopefully there'll never be a pandemic again, but we still need to have a diversified funding. That very same organization I showed you the little video about is struggling right now. They are far away from the main tourism, which I like. It's fun, it's remote, it's really authentic, but they're having a hard time getting enough business. So I suggested different ways from other organizations that are very successful in getting funding. So we need to be diversified. All right, and then I asked the question as a scholar in geography, how can universities play a role? I don't need to go and be the white savior and say, this is how we do it in Singapore, okay? I actually go and I listen when I go to different NGOs and local community ayasans. I want to see how they're doing it. I don't tell them to change anything. I want to learn what they're doing and help them within that framework to restore more effectively. Okay, so what I think we can help with our team here, our key lab team, and some of the locals planting right here, they figured out how to propagate mangroves and coral reefs for the most part. If they need to plant rare species and need more help doing that, sure, we're going to help them. But they haven't found sometimes the most successful locations to plant certain species. Okay, so we use a science-based or citizen science, community science-based approach to help them monitor and understand and compare to a model, a natural mangrove ecosystem or natural coral reef ecosystem. Okay. And then we conduct workshops on education with them, mostly showing them the 360 videos to show them what is there and how they can help. And then, like I said, in the restoration planning, finding the most climate resilient sites that are the most successful with the species that they are able to grow. All right, so next is community science monitoring. So I take my back home in San Francisco, I took my University of San Francisco students. Now these are my geography students from NUS, and we go to Sabah, Malaysia, Borneo, and we help communities with whatever projects they want. This time around, we're helping them with this field monitoring, with drone mapping, simple mapping that they can do with a little grant to get a drone. They love the drone mapping in the communities. It's really fun to work with them on that. They love the technology. And then we're working actually on 2 projects to help one of the village elders who is suffering under climate change. He keeps getting he's 72 years old, Arbu, and his farms keep getting flooded. And that's the only way he has to make a living. There's no more fish for him to fish in the rivers because of too much palm oil. So we're working on these projects with these communities, looking at reference sites and saying, this is the natural site. This is the model for what you want to build back to if it's a mangrove system you're working with. We work with local universities in all these locations, University of Malaysia, as well as this is Unram or University of Mataram in Lombok, Indonesia, monitoring the success of the mangrove ecosystems. Next level, we're helping communities to not just plant successfully, but to restore hydrology and geomorphology, so the geography terms that I teach about. Okay, so what is this? These are the aquaculture, the fish farms, the shrimp farms. How do you restore that back to a mangrove once it's not productive anymore? Not so easy, because mangroves won't grow in these ponds. So you have to reconnect the hydrology. So we study this hydrology. Here's a disconnection showing the brown fresh water going to reconnect it back to having zones in this cross section. So here's just an example in Lombok of how the community is just using simple little shovels to restore connectivity of hydrology. And here's our drone mapping, our 3D mapping in Thailand, where here is the community has created this connection back to the tidal creeks in the sea. The water goes in and out now twice a day. So it flushes and the mangrove trees can grow here. Okay? And then what is happening right here? Well, this is showing the height of the trees. So we can monitor height, survivorship, health, as well as the hydrology using drone mapping. I'm really, really excited about scaling up evaluation through this drone mapping with communities. All right, here's a class that I went, thank you, Rex program, and our Roots to Reefs with the Lombok students and NUS students, working directly with universities every January and summer. And then my third point was to scale up. So a lot of times when we think about scaling up restoration or any type of project, we think about the McDonald's approach, right? An assembly line approach. This looks like, to me, this is not my restoration project, this looks like an assembly line approach. We're planting all the same species because we can find it easily and they grow like weeds. We're planting rhizophora apiculata, maybe. Some sort of red mangrove, which is a most common drought flow. Well, is this going to be resilient? We don't know how climate change is going to change. It's changing rapidly. We don't know how these species are going to react to climate changes. Okay, so we need to start thinking about planting for diversity, as much diversity as possible. And in this nursery at Source, we have 20 different species growing. Okay, so higher diversity in plant species in mangroves and coral reefs means more resilient ecosystems in light of climate change, right? What is another way we can scale up? So I brainstormed this over the pandemic with a collaborator of mine that runs a very successful local NGO in Sabah, Cynthia Hong, and we developed this conference, the first ever community ecosystem restoration conference. We had about 70 to 80 participants from 19 different organizations from top down to bottom up. And we shared knowledge. We didn't have an agenda. We started with no agenda. We just had paper in the middle of the room and red, blue, green pens. And the community came in and said what they wanted to talk about. Then we broke up into small groups and discussed what their concerns were and what they wanted to learn about or share knowledge about. It was really cool. It's a really cool ground up approach to sharing knowledge. And then finally, we need to secure diversified, sustainable funding. They're not just voluntourism and ecotourism and nature-based active tourism that's sustainable, but through apps like the Tree app that sustained Source during the pandemic, and carbon credits that we hear so much about. and Singapore and Indonesia, but it's still the wild, wild west. Okay. And sadly, some of the areas I work in, it's all that we can't get carbon credits for because it's protected on paper, but not through enforcement so much. That's why we need those communities to be the local enforcers on the ground. Okay. And finally, from my travels in West Papua, this is from Bintuni wetlands. A couple of my colleagues from Camphora that were with us, and they're just pointing out that we're doing some research, my colleagues are doing some research on blue carbon conservation projects, understanding the growth rate of the mangrove trees right here, as well as how they compare to the other ecosystems we talked about. They're capturing leaves to measure how much the leaves weigh. They're measuring underground soil capacity as well. And then what I tried to help them with is to do something that was less costly because they have to be verified in the carbon market, they have to use LiDAR. And so your team is going to go and map their mangroves using drone-based LiDAR. It's really expensive. It's great because it's supporting NUS researchers. But we really, if you want to scale up, we need to think about how can we do this in a more cost-effective way. And so just using Drone Deploy that I've been sponsored by this year to go and make social impact around the region, I was able to map in 3D part of their restoration areas that are part of this blue carbon conservation project. This is just showing how you calculate the biomass as a volume. And I know it's very basic, but if we're going to further this and scale this up, we need to think about more cost-effective methods. All right. Finally, about coral reefs. What about coral reefs? Are we doing this here in Singapore? Yes, we are. I'm not going to talk about it though, because that's not where I work. But my colleagues here in Singapore are restoring coral reefs in such unique and amazing ways. Right? But it's because of the work. A friend of mine who works for Coastal Natives edited this film. Ian, thank you, Ian. Okay, and this came out a couple years ago. They wanted to show how beautiful Singapore's coral reefs are, despite how murky it is. I even saw a shark in my second dive in Singapore. Okay, but we do have more pollution, more sediment, more nutrient pollution around urban areas. That's not a critique, it's just a reality in all urban areas around the world. Okay, but what happened in the 80s and 90s especially was a lot of dynamite or cyanide bombing. Okay, does everyone know what that is? Yeah.
I really able the Philippines.
In the Philippines?
The dynamite bombing there is actually organized.
Yeah, absolutely.
Organized.
I actually visualized this underwater, but I saw the hope of recovery in Raja Ampat. Okay, it just takes a long time. And if you continue to bomb and bomb and bomb an area, like in Pom Pom Island where we work, we have to actively restore it because it takes so long to restore. And it's a matter of time. If we go without reefs in a certain area for a long time, we're not going to see recovery. Okay? And so it's a really, really destructive practice. The other hope, I guess I forgot to mention this, the other hope is that there are organizations called, right here, Stop Fish Farming. Okay, you can go to this website that are working on ways to alert the marine police and authorities as soon as they hear a bomb going off. It triangulates. It's what they use in New York City to find people with guns, okay, that are where there's crimes. But they're figuring out ways to go quickly to find those people. And coming from Raja Ampat, what I know about one of the pioneers, Max, who I was working with, what does he do? He was in our session and he was telling us, you didn't hear this, but he was telling me when I went diving with him at Raja Ampat at his eco resort that he actually finds the people that are dynamite bombing and does a citizen arrest because it's within a marine protected area. And he takes them in, and that scares the rest of them. It's scary, he's a cowboy, but it works and it's amazing to hear the stories. All right, so here are the marine protected areas. Through this Indonesian fisheries management zone, as well as the actual marine protected areas, I just want to hone into where I went, Raja and MPA, which is one of the most successful. Thanks, Max and his colleagues and his staff. But there's still issues that he was talking to me about. There's still so many issues with this one I found in a journal article with vessel expansion within marine protected areas that the government knows about. Okay, private expansion of shipping, but there are too many other things happening as well. Here is Sarita Bay, Max's place. Okay, Eco Resort, one of my dive guides. It was an amazing experience. I learned all about what he does for sustainability in coral reefs here. But what he tells me is happening is there's too many homestays, local homestays, and non-sustainable eco resorts. I don't blame the homestays. These are just people that see the Westerners coming in, whoever they may be, making a lot of money off of their beautiful reefs and mangroves. So they want to do it too. I don't blame them. But there is so much of all this unsustainable tourism. Here's a woman I met at lunch. Okay, Mesling's homestay. They're just like this, continuing to be building. But what is wrong with this? The problem is the sewage coming from the people that are staying here. And with cheap ecotourism, they don't have the money or even the education to capture that, filter it, and make sure it doesn't go out onto the reef. So one of the big disappointments in Raja Ampat was the water clarity from this nutrient enrichment, this nutrient pollution, but also from too many liveaboards. I've only been on one liveaboard, but now I don't want to go on any more liveaboards because they dump all their waste out into the sea as well. We need to start thinking about more sustainable solutions if we're going to develop ecotourism in these MPAs. All right, so there is hope of coral reef restoration. I go around diving with people like Festi right here. She works for ocean gardeners that have sites throughout Bali and all the little islands like Nusa Penida off the coast of Bali. Really interesting. They use a local technique of taking coral fragments, broken fragments, and attaching them to ropes. And I thought, why are they using ropes? No one else in Southeast Asia uses ropes that I visited yet. Turns out this was their way of harvesting and producing seaweed. Okay, so they just took the same exact harvesting methods, and now they have nurseries built on that technique. And then they take these big pieces of coral, which they're grown out, and they plant them into the artificial reefs where they've been bombed. So a local technique that works. Here I am at Source, and I'm planting for the very first time in 2019 a coral fragment there on a tree. These are like Christmas trees where they grow out fragments of coral that have been broken. And then once they're about this large, they go from about this big to about this big in 3 months. If they're branching coral, they then place them, break them, or fragment them into small pieces and plant them on to different types of artificial reefs. If they found that if they plant all of the same colony of that coral reef together, they grow 5 times faster than if they grow with other species on average. Okay, and so that's an interesting technique that they are using. It takes a lot of energy and effort though to track which fragment belongs to which colony, but they're doing that effectively. All right, in TRAC, Tropical Research and Conservation Center on Pom Pom Island, they have been using bottle reefs on flat reefs, shallow reefs. This is a bottle that was, I don't know, some sort of Coke bottle or beer bottle that now has encrusting coral and a little bloody fish poking out of it. They roll these in concrete and then place them in concrete blocks and place them upside down on the slopes as erosion control. So Hazel Oakley is testing these methods, different types of methods, in her PhD project. And then here you can see using epoxy glue planting the coral on the reefs. All right, but what about planting for diversity? Remember I talked about how we need to plant more species of mangroves, not just one species. That was my big critique of all these restoration projects. That was just a couple examples, but most restoration projects you see on Instagram are planting this branching coral because it grows fast and it's plentiful. But when you go and dive places like Komodo Marine Protected Area, Komodo Island Marine Protected Area, or Raja Ampat, or Bibidan Island, any of the beautiful, more pristine, historically not impacted reefs, you see this incredible biodiversity that I've been talking about all afternoon. Hundreds, maybe 1,000 species. It's too mind-boggling when you're diving underneath, but just every color of the rainbow. But then why are we only planting a few species of branching coral? So Blue Corner and Andrew Taylor, who I met just recently in September from Blue Corner Marine Research, is doing his PhD in Australia and figuring out how to plant and be successful planting slower growing coral. And I know we're doing that here in Singapore as well, but not as easy when you're in a more remote location. So just recently we started doing that in our Bali, Indonesia location as well. All right, so scaling up this coral reef restoration to end on is about evaluation of the success and failures of this coral reef restoration, just like on land and the mangroves. So our objectives in scaling up reef restoration in the geography department is to visualize in 3D these coral reefs, like I showed you in the mangrove ecosystems. But it's easy to map trees in 3D, relatively easy if you can fly a simple drone, okay? But underneath the water, not so easy. First off, you need to know how to dive or have really expensive equipment for a boat. Okay, so we're figuring out how to do this for community as well as for research. We also want to protect those marine protected areas, protect the coral, but we can't protect it all because there's not enough funding from the government or private funding to enforce. And so we want to find those hotspots of biodiversity so we can protect them. We want to restore and climate smart reef sites and find those locations, and finally, and most importantly, empower the community to do this. Okay? And I really believe through visualization of these 3D maps, maybe we'll 3D print them as well, but showing them on our 360 phones is going to help in this quest. So I met Leon Bui. He was a Singaporean who was just on CNA. He's one of their heroes. He's working in Padang Bai, Bali, and he has the largest restoration project, 5 hectares in Bali, and second largest in Indonesia. So he's scaling up, but he was only, when I went first diving with him, he was only, or mostly, primarily planting this branching coral. We're now starting to plant for diversity and scaling up. This is the challenge. But he went from this in 2019, when he started large scale, to June 2024 with so many species, hundreds of species of corals now, and hundreds of species of fish. Right here in Bali, that has seen a lot of fish farming. All right, they're mostly using reef stars, or at least started using these reef stars created by the Mars Foundation. You'll see this on Instagram all over the world. The Mars Foundation is promoting, they're about this big, and they zip tie these coral fragments to them once you get underwater or on land, like we did here on our pontoon boat. We zip tie them and then we dive them down to the reef and stabilize them on the reef. Okay? That's a very common way to restore coral. Well, he's come up with ways of getting access underneath to sharks, rays. I saw a bunch of rays and sharks underneath this time. Turtles, access to more of the habitat yes, it doesn't look natural, but it's more functionally natural than the stars, which are no one can get underneath. It's just on top, and it's this big, large, continuous reef. This one can be patchy, like a more natural reef. And he's also built octodomes like this for fish habitat. You'll see certain organizations around the world have done different designs like this, but when I dove the other day, over the weekend, I just saw this enormous school of fish, hundreds and hundreds of fish underneath here. And as soon as I walked around, they were protected, or dove around it, they were protected, and they didn't feel like I was going to fish them, I guess. I did see a lot of people spearfishing, so they have protection there. All right, what are they doing? Well, they're scaling up through selling reefs, these stars and the big nurseries to anyone around the world and to businesses. Okay? They also trained now 24 youth to dive, but also they have a huge team that actually works in their conservation project building these structures. They have an organic farm, they have a restaurant, there are all these associated jobs that the locals can have to create a more sustainable livelihood. So these are all considerations when scaling up. Okay, so how do we monitor the success of these projects? Not just in numbers. That's like what you see on every website. How many coral did you plant? How many trees did you plant? How many people did you impact, right? That's what we're always asking in Singapore. Well, how do we monitor the success? Well, I suggest we use drones, because what we found in our recent Reef Check International Line Transect research is that this coral reef right here has been collapsed on Pom Pom Island. Well, this is our new house reef, and it looks pretty natural, but it's patchy. Okay? The study that Mateo and I did a couple years ago, 2024, looks all over Malaysia. Here's Pom Pom Island right over here, using the IUCN Red List of ecosystems to evaluate the risk for collapse of coral reef ecosystems in Malaysia. We couldn't get the data for Singapore, so we went broader to Malaysia. Well, here is the results. And the only thing in black, which is collapse, was Pom Pom Island. We were shocked because we know every bit of Pom Pom Island like the back of our hand. So these line transects are great. There's 30 years since 1997 of data from Reef Check, and it's a start. But we need to add the drone mapping, because we don't have, in this area, track only chose one area to survey, and it wasn't necessarily the healthy reefs. Usually it's the restored reefs or the impacted reefs, okay? So it just lumps everything together. And then when you have patchy reefs, they may be healthy, but they're only 20% covered instead of what they consider healthy, which is 70%, right? Okay, so this is not, even if you're not even a diver, does this look like a collapsed reef to you? Does this look like the fish bomb reef? Well, according to our study results, this is a collapsed reef. Okay? That's my critique. I don't like to critique, but I really critique that method. So then we went to track. Here is Pom Pom Island, the Santa Clara Harbor. Here is Pom Pom, and where they're located on the western side of Pom Pom Island. And my master's student, Wen Chuan, went from, all we have is Google Maps, really blurry, from 1985, to taking photographs and stitching them together to get a really nice high-resolution aerial map. That went then using an AI program, generative AI. She conducted and developed a habitat map. That's great. That was difficult though. This was a master's student in GIS. We need to figure out easier ways for communities to map this, but this is a first start right here. Because if we don't know what we have, we're not going to be able to restore it. So this simple drone right here, I can teach anyone to fly it. These are my students. I taught them in a couple of days to fly it, and this is the beautiful map we got. We can see all these nurseries, all these lines. Okay, here's the East Bali NPA where we are. Our plan, and this is where I'm going to end, our plan is to map all of this in really high resolution. Lewis and I used satellite imagery, it didn't work. The resolution isn't high enough. These are deep habitats in red and shallow in blue. We mapped this whole part of the NPA, but weather is a constraint. So we're going back this summer. Figure out what is that sweet spot. What is the best weather, the best time of the day, and the best altitude to fly at? Then we can train each of these communities to do a simple map, like I just showed you, once a year. Okay? Not easy to catch the drones. Here I am on the pontoon catching the drone. If my student flies it into the top of the pontoon, I have to leap out and catch it. And yes, I did. And I have scars to prove it. Okay, but I still didn't say it. So it's hard to catch, and we cannot penetrate the water. So the final solution I wanted to come up with is, how do we penetrate the water? How do we map in higher resolution in 3D? So one of my students from the Philippines said, oh, I have the solution. I'm doing this great study for my honors thesis on Apo Island in the Philippines that you were talking about, right? So she's using photogrammetry techniques, and just this little pole with 2 GoPros on either end. And she goes like a lawnmower, like my drone does, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It stitches these in a program. She can actually add in the photograph on top of that, but really cannot scale up. This is 5 by 5 meters. And that took her her whole honors thesis. So we have to figure out how to scale this up. So then I thought, what about a ship? What about Ocean X? It's right out here, right, in the harbor, right? And they are doing this, but in the deep seas. Most of this happens from this multi-beam echo sounders and side scanning sonar. All of this is happening at large scale, but in deeper, more murky, turbid water. Okay? So this is the exciting, hot off the press news, is that we now have this guy right here. We're partnering with Yellow Scan. We have green LiDAR, which penetrates the water. And we get a high resolution 3D map of our coral reefs. And here is the plate pattern. You can mount it on any kind of unmanned helicopter or drone. And then they have to be large though, usually, because this weighs 5 kilograms. Okay, so it has to be a really large drone or airplane. But the beauty of this is that it reports this signal that it receives on the water surface and at the bottom. So we can remove that water surface and then get this. Okay, this is the Living Seas Coral Reef Restoration. We can see all of these hatched nurseries and the original coral reef buoys right here. This is the pontoon boat right here. These are the coral heads, the natural ones, and these are the nurseries. Okay. We haven't finished this. We're going to finish this summer, mapping the entire marine protected area. This can be done. It's not that difficult. It's not that expensive. The technology is getting cheaper and cheaper by the day. So we will be able to do this all around Bali and all around Lombok and then into the region. It's just a matter of time. So it's pretty exciting. We get cross sections like this. You can see the water right here, the cliffs, the pontoon, and then the coral reefs below. Okay, so this really quantifies that habitat in 3D. Okay, we need to get that type of structure, not just the structure, to understand survivorship, growth, species diversity, recruitment, and then see all these different colors. That's what we want to get. This again this is the Scripps Institute of Oceanography with Ocean X, just a little bit further from Raja Ampat and Solomon Islands, mapping half a football field. So we're making it a little bit of progress toward that scaling up, but with a lot of money and a lot of expertise, a lot of effort. So while we're waiting for all of this to evolve, that's my dream, by the way, to scale up with Ocean X. So if anyone has any contacts, let me know. I think they would be interested also because what we're doing is immersive education. Right? This is my third research project showing 360 films. This is my driver from Bali, showing the whole community there in Padang Bai the beauty of the coral reef ecosystems. And in Lombok, the beauty of the mangrove ecosystems and what they can do to protect and restore it. So every time we film in a location, like we did here on this island, where they just got funded to help with the restoration project, I show the children and the community. I don't just take my SD card and come back to MUS and show students. I actually go back, and I funded this myself because I believe so much in community-based restoration and the power of the beauty of Southeast Asia and sharing it with them. So like I mentioned earlier, we have this amazing 360 IMAX right down the way, the hallway. And you can see Roots to Reefs or other films. I think we have about 12 films. Or you can watch it in a VR headset. But our current research is looking at the impact of spatial technologies and immersive media, like I just showed you today, in a very small MOE grant, hoping that we can scale it up at least along the Wallace Line and beyond. So just to wrap up, I want to ask this question to you guys. What is the future of coral reefs, communities, and conservation on the Wallace Line and beyond, around Southeast Asia and the world? Do you guys feel hopeful? I hope at the end of my talk you have some more of an understanding of what is happening, how you can get involved, how communities are getting involved, and some of the most recent technology that is helping us protect the biodiversity hotspots across the Wallace Line in Southeast Asia, scale up high resolution mapping and monitoring, strengthening community-led reef and mangrove restoration, and how I like to integrate not just the science education, but also focus on the stewardship of local communities to rebuild and protect regional, this high biodiversity region of the world through collaboration. So thank you guys for coming today. Takes a village to build this type of work, and the thanks collaborators and my team here in Padang Bai. Thank you so much, Sean.
And I just want to do a little advertising here. So the Li Hongqian Natural History Museum will be making a sale of one of its books, 2 Wallace Lines, at a discounted price of $20. So this promotion is available only until tomorrow. And just a disclaimer, the proceeds from the sale of the book was not related to it and not affiliated with NUS libraries in any way. So kindly support them. The Li Hongqian Natural History Museum does do amazing work there. And finally, I'd like to invite our head of collections, Gandhi, to present Dr. Gretchen with a token of appreciation for sharing her knowledge and time with us. So.
Sorry it took so long to track me down.
Oh, you gotta look at it.
And then on behalf of all the members, we would like to thank you for your community service. It's a very great service. Okay, we encourage
Thank you so
We'll
much.
see what we can
Guys gotta look at him.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3. Thank you.
Okay, so you can give a clap for her. I think she did most of her salary for funding this kind of thing, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, applause.
And that brings us to the end of today's session. So for those interested, you can feel free to browse the books on the right side of the room or your right. And also, please do share your thoughts with us. Your feedback is extremely valuable to us in improving future events like these. So please scan this QR code to share your feedback. So with that, I will conclude today's session. And thank you so much. Thank you for everyone for coming today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean.
Is that the red panda, by the way?
Oh yeah. I got
Taylor
it.
Swift.
I got it Chengdu, China. So
Taylor Swift.
Okay.
I can share that.